All right. Well, today my guest is author Will Weaver, who has, I would say, recently written a novel called Power and Light. Power and Light by author Will Weaver. Will, I understand you are a Park Rapids native.
Yes, I'm a proud graduate of Park Rapids High School, it was called back in the day.
Uh-huh.
And, I was thinking there's so many successes coming out of Park Rapids if you just go back and look through the years. And it's a good town to grow up in. We had great teachers, and it really gave me a strong start in life.
You grew up on a farm.
I did. A small dairy farm out by Dorset, 5 miles east of here.
Mm-hmm.
Basic red barn, white house, and black and white cows.
So the Holsteins then?
Yes, they were.
Okay. My mom grew up on a farm with Guernseys, and she said there was always a rivalry with people who had Holsteins. You had, did you have any siblings or anything like that?
Yes, I have two older sisters,
Uh-huh.
and we all three went through Park Rapids High School system, and fond memories of growing up here.
So did you kind of have the typical childhood of a person who grew up on a farm, involving getting up early and helping on the farm, chores and things like that? Those things coming first before everything else?
Yes and no. It was a dairy farm, and so you had work every day, no doubt about that. We had chickens and pigs and all those different animals. But we had, and I look back on this, and it really was a bonus for my growing up. We had a hired man, and he was a local fellow who was, we used to say, retarded. Nowadays, we would certainly use a different term, challenged, special needs. And so he lived with us and was sort of one of the family. Mm-hmm. And so he was the one to get up early and do the milking. And really that did leave me time to do other things, think, study, be in sports. So his name was Carl, and I think back more and more of what a strong impact his presence had on my life.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were the youngest of three, you said?
Yes.
Yeah. So it was never really thought that you would be the one to kind of take over the farm or anything like that when you were growing up, or?
Well, that was always of interest.
Uh-huh.
Growing up on a farm, is that our path in life? And I think in some ways my father maybe thought that. Mm-hmm. I think my mother had other expectations for me. And I remember I was in college by the time that I kind of started to see a little bit of a pathway forward because my high school counselor thought, well, you grew up on a farm, you know how to do things, fix things. Maybe welding school, maybe be a welder. All right.
Good trade.
All right. It's a good trade, honorable trade. But I just kept thinking, there's something more out there for me. So it was eventually off to the University of Minnesota. And by default, just taking classes I liked, I became, as I like to say, an accidental English major. And then it was a question of eventually explaining this choice to my father. And so I was actually a sophomore heading into my junior year. By the time, as I look back now, I gathered up courage to tell my father what I was planning on. Mm-hmm. And I remember that moment, came home, and he was out in the barn, went and met him, and he was eager to kind of hear the news of college life. And he said to me, because he'd been waiting, he said to me, any decisions yet? And I knew what he meant, decisions mm-hmm. about a major. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I paused and I said, Dad, I think I'm going to major in English. And there was this dead airspace, and he looked at me and, no joke, said, son, we already know English. And I will tell you that eventually came around to be a small short story of mine. I mean, it's too good of a line to let go, yes? It was just a magic moment there, this little short story all in itself. It said a lot about me, it said a lot about him, and we got through it just fine.
I'm imagining this to be sort of, I understand your parents were from Scandinavian descent, which is something also like that's similar to the family that you're describing in the book here.
Yes, indeed.
So I'm kind of imagining sort of a very, commonsensical Norwegian farmer from in his 50s or 60s.
Well, you're channeling my background there. It was, we could call, truly a plain style kind of growing up.
Yeah.
We didn't have a TV, not because they weren't invented yet, but by choice. My mother was religious in a fundamentalist kind of way. My father, not so much. He kind of believed in straight fences and even rows and his herd of cattle. But my mother was a woman of faith, and she just could not kind of see what the benefit was for television. And as I look back, I'm kind of glad we didn't have television. I think I maybe became a reader because of that.
I was going to ask you, so when you were kind of growing up, what's the first book that you remember reading, or what kind of books did you like to read in your early years?
Well, the main book lying around the house was my mother's Bible, and some of that certainly, but as I grew older...
King James Version?
Yes, the old one, these and thous, that version. But my mother was also a reader, and back in the day, I wonder if they still exist, there were Reader's Digests, that magazine. I think that's still around.
I actually, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it's readersdigest.com now or something.
It might well be. But there were Reader's Digest magazines, and there were also Reader's Digest condensed books. So the Reader's Digest editors somewhere would take 3 or 4 important novels and sort of shorten them up and squeeze them into one book. So
that's convenient.
It was very
kind of like Cliff's Notes or something, right?
Indeed, it was. It was very fast reading. So I started to read those shortened novels, and I think that maybe eventually bore on my choice to head towards an English major.
Any of those ones particularly stand out in your mind as being particularly, say, memorable?
Well, I think certainly the Southern writer Faulkner. There were a couple of his...
A condensed version of Faulkner? Yes, wow.
Yes,
Isn't the point of it to be not condensed?
He is a wordy guy with very long sentences, but somehow they managed to shorten those up.
Yeah.
I'm not sure really that's a very good thing to do to a classic novel, but Reader's Digest seemed to have power to do that.
You could have the condensed version of Hemingway. It'd be like one sentence.
It would be very short.
Okay, and so you got involved in athletics too in high school, it seems, on the basketball team and
yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Back to growing up on the farm, my life was hunting, fishing, working, putting up hay in the summer, and off to high school, sports, hot rod Chevys and Main Street, and
something about a demolition derby. I saw
all of those things. Yeah, I was kind of a motorhead. I knew how to fix cars, and I liked cars.
Yeah,
and so it was a quintessential kind of American graffiti kind of experience, growing up in Park Rapids in the middle and late 60s. And it was truly a couple of really good English teachers that kind of turned my mind towards other things.
Do you remember what their names were?
Yes, indeed I do. Mr. Carlton Anderson, Ozzy was his nickname.
I know. I met Ozzy.
Yes, he was a fine man, a baseball coach, and an English teacher.
Yeah.
And I remember as I grew to know him as a teacher and a coach, that's a pretty cool combination. He was an athlete.
Yeah.
But he also was not shy about loving literature and history. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting type of man.
Yeah.
Because I was coming out of this strong man, stoic, kind of silent, hunting, working male paradigm. Well, okay, here's kind of a new type of guy, and I like that.
It's almost like some sort of a platonic ideal, right? Somebody who was good at sports and an athlete, but then it was also a philosopher.
Exactly. He had two sides to him, and I thought, that's a pretty good way to live as a man, and I guess that's been my path forward. I mean, I hunt, I fish, I own a lot of guns. Don't make a big deal about them, but I like my guns, and we eat venison. I don't make a big deal about that. I gather wild rice, which we did, but I also have this literary life. So I feel good about that balance.
I happen to agree with you. I think American masculinity, it would be well served if everybody had more balance. Not just one or the other, but both.
Especially nowadays,
Yes.
I think we need a coming together of those kinds of thinking.
So who was the other teacher?
His name was Martin Carter. He was a speech coach, also an English teacher. And here was a truly literary guy. He had just a very successful speech program, plays. And I got to be honest, I never had the courage to be in a play. I just thought, wow, that would be a bridge too far for me. But I appreciated what he did and what Ozzie Anderson did as male teachers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so what was what was it like back then? Well, I shouldn't say that because that's an incredibly broad question, but what are some of the main differences that you notice from when you lived there when you were growing up to, say, today?
I think the main one would be the great changes in farm country surrounding Park Rapids. I grew up on that small, traditional 160-acre farm, dairy cattle.
That's like a claim, what do they call those? That was like sort of a claim allotment, right? That you prove the claim that was
Yes, back in the day, that would have been the case, yes. Farms were allotted 160 acres, and not to be overly intellectual here, but that goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. That was his idea of America, the 160-acre farm, which was just enough for one family to provide all their needs. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we have all these squares. If you look on a plat map, 106-acre squares, they were all that way across America.
Because of Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, wow. Yes.
Okay.
And he was onto something.
Yeah.
Because that was enough land to support a family in a sustainable way. Everything was in this really closed loop. You have the cattle, and they generate manure. Manure goes back onto the fields. It grows the hay. Hay goes back to the cattle. Mm-hmm. Yes? Mm-hmm. And so everything worked. But then came, in, I think, the middle, maybe late 60s, then came potatoes. The potato farms. We'll call them industrial farming. And that was made possible by irrigation. So we had the first of the central pivot irrigators, I think probably around 1965, just south of town. Mm-hmm. The Monaco family, Al Monaco, he was also a teacher, well-known, fine shop teacher, and he had this vision of irrigating fields. Mm-hmm. And so he had the first irrigator and then several more of them. And then came some of the big potato growers from North Dakota, the Offutt, R.D. Offutt, and away we went toward the French fry factory south of town.
Yeah.
And the impact on that was on Park Rapids and the region was absolutely remarkable. The changes that happened because of that.
In what way? Like what sort of changes just to the daily life there for the people, or did the population grow? Or
the population grew. But also, there was a great change in those 160-acre farms. Many of them, the farmers thought, hey, I could sell my farm, get really good money for it, and I could work in the potato business, in the potato industry, and I won't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 365 days a year, and milk my cows.
Yeah.
So we had a real transfer of ownership, and some would say a concentration of capital, into a large corporation and away from that individual farm. Now, it's worked out fairly well in Park Rapids, I think, because our town is doing well economically and people have jobs and so on. But there's also the debate, is agricultural, industrial farming really what we need? Is that the direction? Yes, it gives us cheap food and beautiful French fries, but is it sustainable?
Was the farmer wrong to sell at that time, or was he tricked?
That's a really insightful question. I don't think wrong, because it certainly was individual choice, and maybe farming was hard. They weren't making a lot of money at that time with the small dairy farms. They were not viable any longer. 20 cows, 30 cows were not enough, and so they were just treading water economically. So they could get a good payout from selling their farm and work.
I just wonder why that was. What changed about the economic structure? Because my grandfather on my mom's side was a dairy farmer as well, and he did that for his entire career and retired. And it was a similar situation, 160 acres, and the milk truck would come. He'd sell the milk. He'd get enough to support the family, and it was a nice lifestyle. But now, I hear that it's just something like that is more just like a romantic version of a farm. It doesn't really exist anymore.
It is indeed. And I have been in my writing an advocate of preserving sort of the how it was. What were these 160-acre farms, these quintessential Jeffersonian farms? What was that like?
Yeah.
How did those people live? And so I've got a lot of that sort of embedded in my writing.
So in a sense, it seems as though, it's obviously a very difficult life, and in this particular novel, that life is made even doubly as difficult by the absence of the parents for the majority of at least the part of the story there, and so there's a lot of economic pressure on the farmers at this time to say, do I really need to do this? Or is there some reason other than an economic reason for why I should be doing this? And obviously a lot of them answered no.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the book. Now, obviously, we're not going to be telling the entire story of the book. That's we'll leave that to the reader. But the book does have sort of a prologue that takes place in Norway. So how much research did you do into that section? Because I was really curious about that, sort of what, the causes of the migration from Scandinavia, particularly to this area. It's we've talked of several people who have been, I guess from sort of the pioneers and things like that. And Daryl Hensel has done an extensive genealogical history of his family. But I'm always curious as to what, why there's so many farmers that came from there to here, what caused them to leave, and, frankly, what caused some of them to stay.
Yes. Well, the novel is Power and Light, and it's a title that I use, if you read the novel, both literally and symbolically.
Right.
It is the coming of electricity electrification in the rural Midwest, but also the coming of agency or traction to this immigrant family. And let me just read the summary on the jacket here, so we'll know a little, get a little overview of this book. In 1906, an immigrant family from Norway arrives in North Dakota with dreams of owning land and, quote, moving up in the world. Tragedy plus a crime against them by a powerful man threatens to destroy the family. But an unlikely hero steps up. Jenny Haugen, 17, leads her siblings on a generational march towards agency, justice, and power. Now, I say Norway here, coming from Norway into North Dakota, and there indeed is the family connection. My grandfather came from Norway in about that same year, 1906, 1907. And you ask, why did they come? The problem in Norway was the laws of estate transfer. That's to say, if there was a farm and there were 3 sons or 5 sons, the oldest son got the entire farm.
Primogeniture.
Primogeniture, thank you. Exactly right. And the rest of them were left to fend for themselves. Now, you might think, okay, that's totally unfair, but there is a logic you can apply to that. It prevents the increasing fragmentation of one farm. So, and the farms were not big. They are not big in Norway. A 20-acre farm is a good-sized farm. Mm-hmm. They're small. And so if 5 sons or 5 siblings were to divide all that, we have just a few acres for each one. And so that law was, I think, much about preserving actual farms.
Oh, so isn't that it was a choice, is that you could not?
You could not. You could not. Although we should confirm that. But it was at least the unwritten law that the oldest son got the farm, and the rest were, had to figure out what to do.
And in a family of only daughters, it would be a dowry?
Yes, that's true. That's true, right. And Norway and Ireland and those countries had their own troubles in the 1880s, 90s, and so on with poverty and famine. And it was remarkable how many immigrants came to America. We know that story, yes? We're celebrating St. Patrick's Day today, so many Irish.
Forgot about that.
The Irish came, the Swedes came, the Norwegians came. Yeah. Remarkable numbers.
So it's just by virtue of an increase in population, when you've only got so many farms, now you're going to have 4 or 5 sons. That means that 3 or 4 of them are going to have to go to potentially urban centers in Norway and
work in mills and factories and so on.
Uh-huh.
And they said, I'm kind of speaking for them. They said, we're going to America. There's land. There's plenty of land there. And they were right. They were absolutely right. They could come and homestead.
Yeah.
And you used that important phrase earlier, to prove up a homestead.
Right.
Okay, you had to live on it, 3-5 years, I think?
Yeah.
And pay the taxes, and at that point, it was yours.
Yeah.
So that's a good deal.
Yeah, it's a really good deal. If you think about it, there'll never be a deal like that again, most likely.
No,
right?
That's absolutely right.
Unless we get into space. But so what was particularly attractive about this area? I mean, we love it being Minnesotans. The cold weather, the harsh winds, the snow, the mosquitoes, the ticks. What was particularly attractive to anyone else about this particular area?
We have to go back to land. It was available. It was good farmland.
So they would rather farm than ranch or do something else in a warmer climate.
Yes, and I make a little joke, and I think in this book, or maybe the sequel that's coming out, about my fictional Haugen family ends up in, not in the best of land, but it was the land they could afford, and they chose it because it had sufficient rocks. That's to say, like Norway. Norway is just so rocky and so up and down. And I think for some of the first Norwegian immigrant farmers, the flatness and the open spaces was maybe a little overwhelming. Wow, how do we deal with all this land?
Have you been to Norway before?
Indeed, I have. I did quite a few years ago now, my kind of cliched hjemkomst trip to go back and see where the old farm was and so on.
That's one of the Norwegian terms I think you used in the book, right? And that's
the homecoming.
The homecoming, yes. And you don't always give away the definition of those Norwegian terms in the book, but we're sort of meant to figure them out. And I think
yes, you're right about that. In the early going, it is a kind of a prologue. I talk about the Haugens' situation in Norway, being very depressed in terms of economically kind of slaves.
And there's like a boss there.
There's a boss, owner, and they're treated shabbily, and they are scheming and planning to escape, and their escape is going to be the passage to America and to the Midwest. So,
but now they bring these figurative or maybe literal trolls with them from Norway. So what is a troll?
Well, a troll is a little kind of mythical monster. We've seen those little things in gift shops and ugly little guys.
With the hair that you call,
ugly little guys with a wart on their chin.
Yeah,
and
we've heard of internet trolls too, right? Yeah.
there's that. But these are suffused throughout Norwegian literature and mythology, that they are forest people and live in the woods and under dams or under bridges and so on. So they're part of folklore of Norway, the troll.
Yeah. What's the significance of the troll? Because I think the composer Grieg wrote some music pieces that were descriptive of trolls, and so what's the significance of the troll in the psyche of the Scandinavian? I
think it's part of the pagan background, the non-Christian background, that there are monsters and there are beings out there. So no doubt it's something to do with paganism that kind of worked its way into folklore and children's books and so on.
And what impact can trolls have on our world?
Trolls, well, the internet trolls quite a lot.
Yeah.
But these Norwegian trolls, yes, the Haugens, still, as they come to America, are carrying the old world with them a bit. They're carrying these superstitions, these beliefs, and these beliefs kind of burden them a little bit. The immigrant story really never changes. You arrive, and then you have to deal with language, culture, gaining agency, jobs, land, what have you. And for my fictional Haugen family, the old world of Norway and some of those superstitions kind of hold them back. And gradually, you see among the four siblings in the book that one of them, the youngest, Jenny, is the more modern thinking one. And she's going to be the one to kind of pull them into modern times. In fact, modern times is symbolized by electricity. Yes.
Right.
So there's their start in modernity.
So let's talk about this time period. The book is set, I believe it's... Well, why don't you just tell me the era, because I don't want to misstate it.
Yes, it's set mainly in the middle and late 30s. There's a 5 or 6 year period the novel spans here. The Haugens come, 1906, 1907. I kind of jump forward to seeing them, how they've landed. They kind of landed on their feet, except this crime that happens to them.
Right.
This assault on one of the sisters by a powerful man. And so that puts them back on their heels, and they have to deal with this and figure out how to go forward with this.
Yeah.
But again, the middle and late 30s, and I have here Power and Light arriving about then. But I also make a note at the back of the book that, hey, Power and Light in many areas did not arrive until much later, even in the 1950s, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit of an author's privilege there to bring that Power and Light a little bit earlier because I needed it for my plot, in fact.
So when you came up with this story, did you have this sort of concept that I'm going to use Power and Light and then kind of build a story around that, or did you kind of start with the idea that I'm going to write a story about this particular time period in this particular place, and then the Power and Light idea just seemed to match with it perfectly?
It's the latter, and that is those natural matches and coincidences are some of the real miracles that can happen when you're writing. Because I set out to write a story about a crime, and this crime was deeply embedded in my real family. It happened, as I note in the author's postscript, to a great aunt of mine. She worked for a doctor, boarded. Something happened to her by this powerful man in the community.
Right.
And there was no justice ever for her. And it truly wrecked her life. She became a recluse, the one who stays home, never married.
Right. Yes.
And she was very old when I was a young lad, but I remember I knew there was a secret there. There was this hidden thing among my mother and my grandfather, and they wouldn't talk about it, but I knew something bad had happened to my great aunt. Yeah. And that secretiveness was kind of part of the Norwegian culture as well, kind of a stoicism, and they were not about to thrash this out and talk about it. They just sort of swept it under the rug, and life went on.
It's just another thing to deal with.
Life went on, exactly. But I always remembered it, and I always felt something should have been done. Justice should have been hers, but it never was. And so, in some ways, this novel is my attempt to retroactively go back and at least address this matter.
Do you think that some of the reason why people couldn't get justice? I mean, because obviously the laws were on the books. I mean, any kind of an assault and would have been illegal at that time. But do you think that it's more of a problem of people not wanting to come forward just because they just wanted to say this is going to take too much time away from the farm and the work that we have to do? Or do you think there was more of a problem with, like, say, law enforcement? I wouldn't not necessarily saying a problem, but do you think there was a barrier there in terms of communication with law enforcement, and then getting a prosecutor back then to do something about a charge? Because I tend to think that part of me says, could it really have been that these prosecutors were just knowing that crimes were taking place, were going to say, well, we don't care about that because you're my golfing buddy or something like that? I just don't want to believe that that's in fact the case.
Well, you are a wonderfully optimistic man that justice is always possible. And in the novel, certainly, novels so often revolve around injustice, and Power and Light does indeed revolve around this injustice. But your question is a good one. How could this happen? This injustice, and I think less so a problem with law enforcement than with the culture of the time, the communication of the time. I mean, think of what we have available now to victims of rape. We certainly have better law enforcement tools. We have DNA kits, rape kits, and so on that help prove crimes. Certainly didn't have it then. But we also have advocates and therapists and hotlines, yes, that you could call in and talk about this and open up. Certainly none of those were available back in the 30s. And I think that bore a lot on why my great aunt's crime was never brought to justice.
You know, there's an adage about that particular crime where they say it's an allegation that's very easy to make but ne'er so difficult to disprove.
Yes.
So there's a balance, isn't there? And it seems as though back in those days they looked at it more in terms of, well, you know, it's really just a he said, she said type thing. And these modern, well, I mean, some of them are forensic, but it just seems as though a lot of it more is to develop the witness rather than to try to, assist law enforcement or something like that with actually investigating the charges.
Yes, indeed. And in this case, my fictional character modeled a good deal on my great aunt. Is already kind of back on her heels from, being not too long an immigrant and feeling a part of an underclass as opposed to the powerful forces on Main Street.
Sure.
And all those.
That's the town versus the town folk versus the country folk distinction. Right?
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, and. So that part of the novel takes place in Fargo, and so I'm assuming that you probably did some historical research on that era too. I found that sort of look into Fargo in the 30s to be pretty interesting as well.
Yes, my family, my real family, and my fictional family are located up in northeastern North Dakota in that Rolla, St. John's, Cavalier area. The charge in the novel is eventually brought to court, and the court takes place in Fargo. So, yes, I know Fargo a bit, but it's just a gift now to be able to, Google up something and see a photo of Main Street in Fargo in 1938. Okay, yeah. There it is.
Oh, right.
There are the buildings, there's the hotels, and so on. And that helps me get things right because readers take great pleasure in finding smaller errors. And some of those, when we're writing more historically, a historical novel, are obviously what we'd call anachronisms, something being out of time. Okay, this wouldn't have been the case here. They wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have said that. This language is used later. They wouldn't use that phrase and so on. So it's very important to get things right. Now, I get them as right as I can, but authors also have help. We have an editor and a particular type of editor called a copy editor, same as a proofreader. And again, I will get it as correct as I can in my mind, and then that copy editor will go through it truly with a fine-tooth comb, with a magnifying glass, and we'll look for things. But still, sometimes little errors slip through.
How long does that process take?
Probably several weeks. Not certainly a month. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks for a copy editor. And they have their tricks. They will read it sometimes backwards just to make sure they're seeing things correctly, and they will challenge everything that I have, assuming that I may have made an error.
So, how many novels have you written?
I believe an even dozen. I've written several during a period for younger readers, for teenage readers. And
yeah, I saw something in there about baseball books.
Indeed. There was a period, I started out with a couple of big successful books, novels for adults. The first was Red Earth, White Earth, published in the late 80s, and that was right out of our experience here in Park Rapids with culture clash, native and white. I started school with quite a bunch of kids from White Earth Reservation and surrounding, and as the grades went on, there were fewer and fewer of them. They just sort of went away. And they didn't have the support systems, they didn't have the encouragement. It was a long bus ride from Osage and Ponsford, and the dropout rate was very high. And in the 1980s, middle 80s, there was sort of in combination with the 60s and the politics of the 60s, the Native American communities developed more of an edge, and they were up to challenging things like, okay, you call it the White Earth Indian Reservation. Why is it owned 92% by whites? If it's our reservation, why is it owned by whites?
It's a good question, and it's actually something I discussed with Mike Swan. I don't know if you know Mike, but
I don't.
Yeah, but I asked him that exact same question. But anyway, so I'm sorry. Go on.
Yes,
I was curious about that.
Coincidentally, my grandfather had a farm on the White Earth Reservation on the far east side, over by Osage. And so his farm, our family's farm, became caught up in a land claims movement. And it was very tense and large meetings, angry meetings. White farmers were worried they were going to lose their land. Their land titles became clouded, as we would say. We're in a law office setting here. That's a common term whereby, okay.
I know it well.
Yes, there's a problem with your land title. And so essentially, your land is really not worth anything because you can't sell it.
Yes, alienability
All right.
is one of the bundles of the sticks of property ownership, right?
I did not know that
You
term.
don't. Well, you don't
but it
really. You don't really own. You can't. Like what you said. It has to be alienable. Otherwise, you don't really own it.
Yes, and you can't borrow against it because its value is essentially zero. And so suddenly, so many of the farmers in that area were truly up in arms. I mean, literally. And it was very close to bad violence. And but there were some political initiatives that kind of let the air out of it, the released valve in a way, and some of the land was bought back for the White Earth, and that process continues right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's sort of what I understood from talking to Mike about it. Mike's a White Earth tribal elder, and basically the way that he told me is, or the way that I understood him explaining it was that that some people just simply decided to sell their land. It was almost as simple as that.
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
But my novel, Red Earth, White Earth, was about that exact dilemma. Okay, here it is in a nutshell. It's my family's farm, my grandfather's farm, and I had to be honest, my sympathies lean toward the native claims. I mean, really, as you do the research, you can see how it happened, how they lost the land. Lost the land by allotment into 160-acre parcels.
Yes.
We're back to that. And then those were taxable. The native residents were not used to taxes. The land went tax forfeit, and it was bought by white farmers. Okay, including my grandfather.
Yeah.
All right. So there we're in a real dilemma,
Yeah.
and there's nothing more interesting for the novelist than a true dilemma like that.
Yeah, and that also kind of brought up the question during my conversation with Mike about whether it would have been preferable, because of course Red Lake. Okay, now I'm confused because you talked about the title of your book, but no, Red Lake is a closed reservation.
It is.
And White Earth is not.
Is not.
And so I do not believe that a non-native could purchase land in Red Lake.
That's absolutely true.
And so I kind of asked the question, well, if you could do it all over again, would you have made White Earth a closed reservation? But the answer I got from him was that it seemed to be sort of like there was some disagreement within the native community. Some people liked it better the way that they had it up there, and some people liked it better the way they had it here. But it's a complex question, isn't it?
It is, and with some irony, it has come around full circle once again right now, with you reading in the newspaper, seeing it on the television news about the White Earth forest around Detroit Lakes. And it's a big tract of land, 100,000 plus acres. And some in the tribal community of White Earth would like to have it all back, take control over it. And people who use it for recreation, hunting and fishing, say, hey, we don't want that. We've been making use of it for years, and we're going to lose that. Tribal people are saying, no, we're not, but we're having these big angry meetings again. And I hope that can be resolved better than it was back in the 1980s.
Yeah, but this current issue that's going on, that doesn't involve divesting people from land that they own.
No, it would not.
Okay.
Just about management and control.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I haven't studied the subject enough to speak intelligently on it, so I won't.
Yes, but we took a long detour about the question of young adult novels.
Yes.
And Red Earth, White Earth, first adult, and then story collection after that. And then I have a couple of kids of my own, and I began to see my son in particular. Well, he was a reader, I guess by default. My wife and I were both teachers by then, English teachers, and so we had a lot of books around. But I could see his Little League teammates and friends and stuff, and they were struggling a bit with reading because of one particular issue, and it was this big giant zombie lurching eastward from California, and its name was Nintendo. Yes, you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
It was the first generation video games.
Yes.
And even then they were fun. I tried them a little bit. Oh, these are cool.
I remember the old 8-bit Nintendo, and the first time I ever saw it at a friend's house.
Right.
And just how shocked and amazed I was by seeing it. Yeah.
Nintendo, and Sega Genesis, and some of those. And I thought to myself, holy cow, books are going to be up against it, up against electronic games, video games.
Oh, definitely.
And they were, and they are. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, I thought, I'm going to write a book or two that these young men in particular would read. And it happened to be first three were a baseball trilogy. And nothing new or different. Farm kid is a good baseball player. Town boys don't like him. And so there's conflict. And they work it out over the space of 3 books. And it was a great seller. HarperCollins, one of our biggest publishers, published it and loved it. And especially teachers grabbed a hold of it, because they were looking for books that, as they say, my boys will read.
What is it about baseball books that attracts boys so much? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, to second and third grade and everything, we had a school library, and I'd always just go in there and look for books on, like old baseball players like Ty Cobb and Stan Musial and of course Babe Ruth and stuff like that. But what is it about baseball in particular that just captures the imagination?
Well, it's that, again, maybe quintessential Americana thing. It's the national game and so on. So there's that, and it's sports in general. But these 3 books were winners, and I wrote another 2 or 3, and they were well liked, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to really challenge myself in terms of this demographic of readers. I'm going to write some books for boys who hate reading, actively hate reading. And these, as teachers will say, are often young men, particular, some women, who like cars and hate their English classes. And so I wrote a series of 3 stock car novels. Again, I could muster that. I could pull that back. I haven't forgotten, you mentioned Demolition Derby.
Right.
I drove in the first one in Hubbard County ever. And it was, I learned about impact. I learned,
Yeah.
yes, let's all hope not to have a car crash. But those books, my little stock car novels, again, were seized on by teachers and librarians for this particular stratum of young readers that actively disliked reading. And so the teachers would have something in hand. Well, what do you like to do? Well, I like cars, like fixing motors and stuff. I got a book for you.
Yeah.
And so
That must have been successful too.
it was. But that detour took longer than I imagined. It was several years and about 6 or 8 of these novels. And then I thought, hey, I'm kind of losing my adult voice here. And so I made a turn in the last 3 or 4 years back to novels like Power and Light.
And now this is the first part of is it a planned trilogy? Or?
It will be 2. I think there's a sequel. I think I can wrap it up in a sequel.
Okay.
And that is an interesting matter. Sequels are tough because they have to stand alone, be their own thing, but they also depend on the previous novels. So sequels are a real challenge. I'm right in the middle of that right now.
Okay, so that's your current project
Yes.
that you're working on. Any anticipated date?
We hope by the very end of this year, 2024, we'll have it out. So it's moving along quickly.
Very ambitious.
Yes, it is.
So you've also had a career as a writing professor at BSU?
Yes, there are very few writers who make a living solely writing. We could name a few of them. Stephen King.
J.K. Rowling?
J.K. Rowling, Stephen King.
Okay. Aside
yes,
from them,
yes,
everybody
but-
has a day job.
But Ed, that's so true. Truly a handful, if you kind of boil it down.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
2 hands and 2 feet make a really good living. And that has become a problem in the publishing industry. The big 5 publishers, HarperCollins, Simon Schuster, and so on, are increasingly risk averse in terms of taking a chance on a new writer.
Just like Hollywood.
Exactly like Hollywood. And so they said, oh, we know Stephen King's going to sell. Pretty soon, Stephen King or J.K. Rowling are going to get all the money. They're going to be the last 2 standing. And that's kind of sad. But there's also been some real exciting changes in the publishing industry, the rise of, you could call them hybrid publishers, who will say, okay, I'm halfway between Simon & Schuster and taking your novel down to the copy shop. We're in the middle here. We're professional, but we're going to offer you a joint venture. If you kick in some money, we'll provide everything else. We'll make that book for you. We'll edit it. We'll copy edit it. We'll design a cover, and we'll help you market it.
That was the question I was going to ask. So they do help promote it as well.
Yes, and Power and Light is published with a hybrid publisher. It's
What's the name of the publisher?
Calumet Editions in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And of great interest, the book right now is a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award.
Oh.
In the novel category. There are 4 finalists, and the other 3 are kind of power names in the Twin Cities, and their publishers are all big New York publishers, but mine is not. So we think we can compete with one of the big 5 publishers. And the hybrids are really disrupting, you could say, the publishing industry.
Yeah.
They're creating space for new writers, and their quality is rising to compete with those big publishers.
Yeah, sounds like a breath of fresh air to me. If it's anything like, I mean, I being a consumer of movies probably more than books. I hate to admit, but it just seems like there's just so little creativity involved in the new things that are being put out these days. Everything's a pre-existing IP, you know.
Yes.
That just one author can write 20 novels, and you know, let's go with that, right?
Right. But we have in digital electronic publishing, we have so many more opportunities. But maybe the downside is that every person now can be a novelist. In 6 months from now, you can write something and publish it, and so we are kind of flooded with intellectual property, as you say, not all of which is very good quality, or is edited, or is proofread, copy edited, and so on.
So what makes writing good or distinctive?
I think my goal as a writer is to give you, the reader, zero excuses to stop reading. Number one, I don't want to bore you. Number two, I don't want you to see a spelling error. That should be out of there already. Number three, I want to have an ongoing plot that pulls you forward. I want you to have a sense of direction, that you know it's going someplace. And I want it to have a satisfying conclusion. And along the way, I want the sentences to be good. I want distinctive images, description. I want them to sound sort of smoothly, invisibly as you read them in your head. So there's a lot of very subtle things that go into making writing really good writing.
Is it possible to have a great story but result in a poor novel, or vice versa? Is it possible to have a bad story and yet create a great novel?
Those are good questions. I think if we were totally able to distill down what makes a good novel, it is, number one, as you say, a good story. And the second part is well told. A good story well told. And there's a lot of good stories. We all have good stories. But the telling of them, the writing, the expressing is the real challenge. And that's where you can, by reading, you can feel the quality, and I think a good book, between an amateur book. Yeah. And if you look closely at the writing, look at the sentences, you'll see that some are just better than others.
Yeah. Have you looked at all at AI-generated writing?
This is another big, giant zombie lurching towards us on the horizon, truly. The people in the film industry, and I'm still a little bit connected, I've had a couple of film adaptations, are worried sick about AI, artificial intelligence. And they believe right now that within 2 or 3 years, all the soap operas could be, all the writing, all the scripts could be generated easily by AI. And maybe we can imagine that easily, because there's so many cliched plots in the soap operas, the Hallmark movies, the Christmas movies, and so on. But soon those scripts will be pumped out within maybe seconds by AI.
Mm-hmm. What would make a writing distinctly human versus something that was just generated on a formulaic basis, even though it's a complex formula by an AI?
I think right now there's a search for truly distinct, underreported communities. That's to say, of activity, like my little stock car novels. My 3 stock car novels focus around dirt track racing, small speedways. Well, there's a lot of focus on NASCAR in the world, a lot of focus on Formula One, but this small town speedway lifestyle is rich, full of life and quite remarkable. And filmmakers, actually, there's been several that have tried to get my stock car novels into a series. It's going to happen at some point because they see that as a really unique, authentic lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so little authenticity nowadays, as you're suggesting, in terms of plots and formulaic movies. So once they can find an authentic part of America, like Yellowstone, that whole series Yellowstone. Okay.
I didn't watch it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I haven't really either, but my filmmaker friends say, hey, Yellowstone is the thing right
it was
now
good. Yeah.
in filmmaking. It's sort of a subculture, ranch, horses, small town, etc. So,
well, it's interesting though because that's a Western plot or something like that, and you think, okay, well, AI could come up with something like that, but like just take that as an example, the Western, right? You can take pretty much any story and just make it a Western. I mean, I think that's one of the beauties of the Western film is that it's so versatile, but aside from just sort of like you plug in the protagonist, the antagonist, the conflict, the resolution, and all that stuff, that could all be generated by AI. But I like what you said about that sort of finding an authentic but a real experience that exists out there.
Yes,
that an AI could not discover.
That's
because an AI is not in this world.
That's exactly it. And to have a plot and characters who are bringing information forward that AI simply does not know.
Yeah.
How to castrate a horse.
Sure.
How to fix a broken piston. AI doesn't know that. But there are people who do, and they're the ones who make for authentic story and filmmaking.
Well, and also I think there's an element of unpredictability in human interactions that an AI could not capture sufficiently. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people do things that are unexpected or shocking, or they behave in ways that are inconsistent with past behaviors.
Yes. I do think we're going to get novels written by AI pretty soon.
I think so too.
Yeah, no doubt.
But I'm just sort of expecting it to be the dialogue to kind of follow along in terms of this is what character B would say in response to what character A said, and then this would be the response based on that sort of back and forth, very, very logical. You can draw on millions of different sources for that, but it's still always going to come back to what is the average response to this statement to go back and forth. And why are we having this conversation? Well, because we need it to set up, this other plot point. But then, you just take it even further back and say, okay, well, what is a novel? A novel consists of the following elements, and it's going to have these things. It's going to have a resolution at the end, and so the rest of it is just sort of rearranging pieces here and there. But I think that's really where AI is going to fail. At least I hope it does. Is that it's not going to be able to find things that are truly interesting in the sense that they're fascinating or whatever the case may be, because they're relatable to us, that we can say, wow, this actually exists. I cannot believe there's a small town where they have these little dirt track stock car races. And
I can't believe people know this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like this actually exists, so yeah, but I mean, if it took over for the writing for soap operas, I don't think anybody would notice. And frankly, right. I don't think they would care. I know the Writers Guild would probably care.
They would, indeed. And that was a big part of the recent strike.
Is that right? Yeah.
That was resolved a few months ago. The Screen Writers Guild were very concerned about losing jobs to AI.
Yeah. So as we wrap things up here, I'll also ask you, being a writer and a professor yourself there, can writing be taught? Can the ability to write well be taught?
I think so. because there are certain fundamental techniques. And I have taught writing for many years at Bemidji State. I'm retired now to focus fully on my writing, my own writing. But I can teach you the techniques of fiction, starting from plot and description and dialogue and so on.
Yeah.
So I can give you those, but I can't give you that other little part, in no small matter, of a creative idea to wrap these around. And so that's got to come from you.
And some people can have those, and others
some
don't.
maybe.
Can you stimulate that in some way, or is it that's the question I'm asking is it possible, if a person set their mind to it, to have those types of ideas, or not?
I think in some ways, it has people, for example, to take an inventory of events, incidents in their lives that still sort of hum and buzz in their imagination, that keep poking at them. And if you do that, you'll say, hey, there was something about that night when Danny rolled his car. There's something about that night that I should express and explore. I'm not fully done with that particular night. And then with the techniques of fiction, you can wrap a story around that.
What advice would you have for a young person who wanted to make a career in writing?
I think to be a writer, you must be a reader, and certainly not to borrow other people's stories, but to see how they do it. How does Stephen King do it? He keeps our interest. His images are so creepy sometimes. We can't get them out of our head. How does he do that? And at some point, if we are a practicing writer, to lay a page of our writing alongside another novelist, a published novelist, and say, okay, how is my writing different? How do my sentences compare to this other writer? And that can be super instructive.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be, yeah. Well, Will Weaver, thank you so much for joining me today, making the time, driving down from Bemidji. I really appreciate it. And again, the novel is Power and Light, and it's available, published by Calumet Editions. I believe you can purchase it on willweaverbooks.com.
Yes, or your local bookstore, as I'm fond of saying.
Yeah, including the Beagle bookstore here in Park Rapids.
One of my favorite bookstores, Beagle Books on 3rd Street. And one of the things that all writers now depend on are reviews, and Amazon, Barnes & Noble are a good place if you like the book to pop on there and leave a little review.
Even if you didn't buy it there.
Even if you didn't buy it there, you can still leave a review. Those are very helpful in getting the word out about a book you like.
Okay. Well, again, Will Weaver, thanks for being my guest today. It was nice to meet you and get to know you a little bit, and hopefully we can have you back when you publish the sequel.
My pleasure, and great to be back in my hometown.
Thank you, Will.